Hey everyone, RogueGold here, and today I want to have a discussion on the upcoming second raid for the Division 2, that being the Foundry. What sparked my interest in making a video on this now is that we actually have two new pieces of concept art for the raid that the devs released in this week's recap blog, and we'll get into those in just a moment, but first I want to go over the history and controversy that has surrounded this raid thus far because it's pretty interesting and important regarding the upcoming Gear 2.0. So to start, if you didn't know, this raid was initially supposed to come with TU6, however about a week or two before its release date, we got the news that it was being delayed into 2020. Now if you're unfamiliar with this raid entirely, what we know is that obviously it's called the Foundry and it's set to feature the True Sons as the enemy faction that we're going to be taking on. They previously showed one panel of concept art for it, and as you can see, it seemed pretty intriguing. Definitely a very different environment from the airport in dark hours. So after that delay in 2020, there was speculation that it would be coming with Episode 3, but as we found out not long ago, it is slated for mid-2020 by the devs. The pretty interesting bit about its set time frame for release is how it somewhat coincides with what we understand about Gear 2.0 and the new world tier releasing. If you haven't heard, there's actually a pretty widespread rumor that the Foundry was indeed ready to be released with TU6, but with the devs knowing that these massive changes to the RPG core of the game were coming, they scrapped most of the internals of the raid and started fresh. I doubt they redid any of the physical environment and layout of the space itself, but most likely the majority of the encounters and boss fights were redone from scratch. Now that may seem pretty infuriating to some, and while I'm certainly disappointed that we're having to wait so long to play this new raid, I think it also hints that the idea that we're in for a pretty challenging and fun experience whenever this thing ends up launching. So, I have some thoughts and ideas that I want to share on how I believe the devs may be constructing this raid, but first let's look at these new concept art panels. The first here looks to be from the beginning of the raid, or a transitional point where the team is outside, about to head into the Foundry itself, and this environment looks really beautiful and unique. It looks abandoned and somewhat reclaimed by nature, and so that should be definitely very cool to explore. Next, we've got an interior picture, and this just looks awesome. It's very reminiscent of the first piece of art we got way back when, and those cauldrons of molten metal look super cool, and I wouldn't be surprised if those were incorporated into the mechanics somehow, with that stuff dropping down onto the floor or your team. Alright, so we've gotten a look into the aesthetics of the raid, but what about the content and mechanics? Well, like I said, the devs have been refining these fights for quite a long time now to pair up with the new concepts that Gear 2.0 is bringing to the game, so I think we can start to draw some conclusions about what we might see. A big focus for Gear 2.0 that the devs have been stressing on this week's Day of the Game is that they want there to be real roles within groups and have good synergies going. Keeping that in mind, one of the biggest complaints with the first raid, despite it being pretty good for the first attempt at a raid by Massive, was that it didn't require much besides straight DPS builds. The fights had interesting mechanics, but they all involved shooting one thing or another with certain timing in order to beat the encounters. Now sure, you definitely needed health for the Weasel fight, and having super low armor was a bit of a disadvantage, but for the most part, nothing in the realm of tanks or skill builds was needed or encouraged. So, with this new philosophy of trade-offs and roles the devs are pushing, I really believe these kinds of builds will be key in completing this new raid's mechanics. Let me give an example of how both a skill build and a tank could be utilized within a raid boss's mechanics. Let's start with skill builds. Imagine there's a weak point or panel somewhere in a room that you have to shoot within 30 seconds in order to begin the damage phase for a boss. But then you find you can't actually get an angle on said panel with your character. What the devs could do is make it a targetable enemy, meaning you could send your assault drone or whatever other skill up to go shoot it. What you'll find though is that given the 30-second window and the health of the panel itself, you need a pretty high-powered drone and skill-focused build in order to complete that mechanic. You see what I mean? It could be pretty cool. And there's plenty more ways you could incorporate different types of builds into a fight that would be just as crucial as damage builds are. Let's look at a tank, for example. Maybe some sort of mechanic involving the forging and heat of the Foundry means that there's a fiery exhaust that blows from one end of the room to the other, affecting everyone on the ground. The way to shut it off is a button against the wall it's blasting from, and the incoming wind means your movement is slowed while you walk towards it. However, the mechanic is that whoever's closest to the source of the inferno takes the highest percentage of damage, while everyone behind them gets their incoming damage mitigated. So the most effective, or perhaps the only way to beat the mechanic, is to have a tank build, someone with 5 to 6 of their core attributes invested in armor, to tank the damage and for everyone and push forward towards the button. You could even further incorporate group synergy by making it so that the tank needs a healer to put their Seeker Miner drone on him to heal him up while he makes the push. So there's just so many options that you could have for these types of synergies that just makes me very excited to see what the devs have come up with. And also, this is not to say that I think damage builds should be invalidated, I just think there should definitely be a variety in types of builds needed to succeed. A good example of where damage would be needed is where you have to kill an enemy high up on a catwalk before he reaches the other side, otherwise the group gets wiped. Since the tanks and healers have to trade off their damage in order to be good at what they do, you would have to have someone with a sniper or high damage build in order to burst this guy down before he wipes the team. So as I'm sure you've picked up on, there's many different avenues they could take this, and I'm really hoping they do. A raid experience where you need this level of team play and coordination would be very extremely challenging and fun to play through, so let's hope that's what we end up getting. I'll leave it here, guys. Let me know what you think of these concept art panels, thoughts on the raid as a whole, and what mechanics and group synergies you want to see come into play. Leave a like if you enjoyed this video, subscribe with notifications on so you know every time I upload, and until the next one, guys, RogueGold, out.